Hi everyone, I'm Aditya Balu and I'll be continuing this tutorial with a new session on building and deploying CNN-based solvers. The outline of this session would be, first I'll cover a brief summary of physics-informed neural networks, which we learned in the last two sessions. And then I'll go through some preliminaries required for this session, which are the convolutional neural networks and convolution operations. And then I'll go into finite difference / finite volume based discretizations. And I'll later on go into finite element based discretization methods and how you define loss function for these methods. And then finally show you a demo with few concluding remarks. So let's get started. So as a recap of PINs, so in the last two sessions, we looked at how the physics-based surrogates using neural networks are very important. And particularly they are used for two kinds of problems. One is a forward problem where you're assimilating physics information from partially observed data. And the other application is in inverse problems where you would like to perform a design given a physics-based constraint. So these kinds of inverse problems and forward problems both require fast and very accurate modeling of the physics. So as you can see on the left bottom, you see that a deep learning based neural surrogate is able to predict the solution very close to how you get in a finite element based solution. Same way on the bottom right, you see an example of how you can design a bioprosthetic heart valve by using a neural surrogate. In this case, you have a reference configuration of a bioprosthetic heart valve, and this reference configuration of bioprosthetic heart valve is then sent to a deep neural surrogate to obtain the deformed configuration of this bioprosthetic heart valve. So these are two particular applications we are showing of how neural surrogates have been used. But of course, there are a lot more number of applications which we have shown in the previous few sessions. And particularly in the last session and the session before, we looked at physics-informed neural networks and its variants in a fair amount of detail. So in physics-informed neural networks, you have the X and T, which are points, collocation points defined in the domain of space and time. And using these X and T, you predict a U hat using a neural network, a deep neural network, which could be having several layers of hidden neurons in between. And those the weights of all these neurons together is represented by this theta. And once you have this physics-informed neural network, now it is a neural network. Physics-informed neural network comes with the additional parts, but just the neural network comes from this U hat. Once you have this U hat, now you can, using automatic differentiation, define the PDE operators, which is dou by dou t, dou square by dou x square, and other boundary conditions and initial conditions, which you see here. Once you define these operators, now you can evaluate the strong form residual or a weak form residual in the case of variational methods. And using these residuals and all, you can minimize the loss, which is a convex combination of all the different losses, which is the initial, the PDE loss and the boundary condition loss together. And you minimize that to get theta star, which is nothing but the optimal theta for minimum loss. And with this setup, now when you, for any new point of X and T, now you can predict accurate U hat, which satisfies both the PDE and the boundary conditions and initial conditions. So before we go further into this session on building CNN-based surrogate solvers, let's look at something about what neural networks we have learned about so far and what convolutional neural networks is. So far in this tutorial, we have covered about dense neural networks, where you start with a vector X shown on the left over here. And from this dense vector X, you go to a dense vector or a flattened vector Y. And when you have this kind of a setup, you use several dense fully connected layers in between, and then you perform the optimization for getting optimal weights. The optimization is simple. We have looked at earlier as well, how you perform minimization of the loss using stochastic gradient descent or some variant of stochastic gradient descent. And we have also looked at how different learning rates and different other hyperparameters uh, make your loss either go up, in which case it is unbounded, and or when you use a very low learning rate, then it converges very slowly, and using a very high learning rate can also lead to suboptimal solutions or local minima in that case. And this is the overall picture of what optimization is and everything. So in other words, what's happening is you have a dense vector X and a target vector Y, which is again a dense vector. And from this kind of a dense vector X to dense vector Y, you are performing a training for such a dense neural network. Now, what if X and Y are no longer just dense vectors, but they are, say, a 2D input or of a field, or a spatial input of a field in a discrete sense, or say it is an input such as an image, which people have studied for a while. So the reason why we are looking at it is the whole class of problems we looked at in the last two sessions is this point-wise prediction-based approach, where you're using point collocation, which is each point in the domain, and you're performing operations at each point of the domain and predicting using automatic differentiation the residuals, and you're optimizing the residuals and all. So this approach is the first class of problems we looked at in the last two sessions. Now we are going to look at a discrete field prediction based approach, where you, instead of predicting for just a few collocation points in the domain, you define a discrete grid, a mesh grid. And from this mesh grid, you take this as an input and send it to a neural network. Obviously, this is not the same dense neural network we looked at earlier. This GNN then predicts a mesh grid of UD values, which is the solution of the field, the PDE, the partial differential equation we are looking. The reason why we look at it is there are a lot of challenges, which as we covered in the previous to previous session, actually, about how there are still some challenges in physics informed neural networks and its variants, and how we need to improve on it. So one way people have, researchers have tried to improve on this physics informed neural networks is to bring in the notion of what we have already known for several decades of numerical methods and other things. While it is good that physics informed neural networks are mesh free and they work on point based classification, it is also important to look at this grid based approaches, where you don't need to use automatic differentiation, and you don't need to perform this operation over by retraining it again and again. In this case, you don't need to retrain it again and again, because you have a grid. You can choose multiple grids, and you can naturally solve for a parametric PDE rather than one single instance of a PDE. So with all these kinds of advantages, we choose this approach, which obviously brings in another advantage of you don't need to rely on automatic differentiation to get the derivatives of these spatial variables u. Instead, you can get the derivatives from the spatial derivatives. In the case of finite difference, you get the derivatives using the Sobel filters, using Sobel filters or some convolution operations, as we will cover later on. But also for finite element, you can define these derivatives much easily. So this is the idea of what the inputs and outputs of the neural network are. So depending on these inputs and outputs, now next few slides, we'll be looking at how we define the neural network to learn from this input to output. And then minimizing the loss, backpropagation, and finding optimal parameters, which we looked at in the previous sessions, will remain similar. Minimizing the loss is one particular section we will cover again in the context of how you define the discrete derivatives and how you evaluate those discrete derivatives, but pretty much rest of the things remain the same. So, so as I was saying, that we'll look at convolution layers and what convolution is for a particular 2D image per se, or a 2D field. So in this case, you can assume that let's consider that this to be a 32 by 32 by 3 image, where this 3 could mean RGB channels of an image, and 32 by 32 means the height and width of the image. But this could also mean that you have a 32 by 32 nodal grid with XYZ as your channels of your grid. So in other words, each node in your grid has some XYZ. So now you can define for this kind of a structured grid of XYZ, you can define all kinds of operations of convolution and all over here. So once you have this kind of an image, what does a convolution layer mean? In a convolution layer, you take a filter, which could be a 5 by 5 filter or a 10 by 10 filter or any kind of a filter, lesser than obviously the size of the image which you have. So this 5 by 5 will be mapped onto this this original image, and you superimpose to compute the dot product between each pixel here to each pixel here. So obviously each pixel or each node in this image will be mapped to one node in this convolution filter. So since there are 3 dimensions here, you need to have 3 dimensions here as well. Then only you can perform the dot product. So that gives us a dot product for each of this. And then you can also perform dot product of the 7 other dimensions as well. So in other words, what's happening is that if you use a 5 by 5 by 3 filter, that's your W, and you apply that convolution on one particular patch of the image, then that patch is going to give you a 5 by 5 values. And in other words, what's going to happen is your weights is going to be 5 times 5 times 3, which is 75, plus a 3-dimensional bias. And that will give us, basically, you can perform this computation and give one value. By the way, it's not 3-dimensional, but it is 1-dimensional bias. This is going to give you one value, and this one value, which you get over here, will be representing this 5 by 5 feature. In other words, if I now convolve it over the whole image space, then we get another image which will look something like this. So in other words, you're taking 32 by 32 by 3, convolving it with 5 by 5 by 3, giving us 1 by 28 by 28. This output which you get from a convolution layer is called an activation map. So this activation map can be obtained for multiple filters. So imagine you have another filter, another 5 by 5 by 3 filter, then you get another activation map. And so in the same way, you can apply 6 such 5 by 5 by 3 filters, giving us 6 activation maps. In other words, your convolution layer is now taking us 3-dimensional channels to 6-dimensional channels. Why is this important? Because initially you are dealing with in a 3-dimensional space. Now these 3-dimensional space input is now elevated to a very higher dimensional space by the 6-dimensional channels. At the same time, all the features in this 32 by 32 image or nodal information is now like condensed into this 28 by 28 image size. So now once you define one convolution layer, you can perform a ReLU on top of it. So in this case, it's you're performing a convolution layer with ReLU. This convolution layer in this case is going to perform a 5 by 5 convolution on these 3 channels and give you 6 such filters. So you have 6 5 by 5 by 3 filters, and that gives rise to this. You can also apply another layer. Now, instead of 6 filters, you can apply 10 filters. And then same way, instead of 5 by 5 by 3, it is going to be 5 by 5 by 6 because there are 6 inputs here. And so on. So this is a series of such convolution layers forms a CNN or a convolutional neural network. What are we learning in this? We are learning different features in an activation map. So in one activation map, as you can see for a particular action, like image, something like this, your filter learns different features. These features in the primitive sense could learn first some edges and some more primitive features, like what are the shapes and sizes in each pixel. And from these images and each shapes which you're like obtaining features obtaining from the first layer, you process them to get more abstract features, and from those abstract features you learn more complex features, and then you go on further and further. As a typical example usually given in a machine learning course is how you are given an image of a face and you're performing some key point detection, then your first convolution layer learns the features of your eyes and nose and ears or some edges corresponding to those. And then actually in the next activation map, you learn the ears, face, ears, nose, eyes, and all those features itself. First you learn about edges or some features leading to these features, and first, then you learn these features, and these features together form a complex face, and that complex face is then used for image recognition. So that kind of a hierarchy is mentioned in terms of how you learn in a convolutional neural network. Why is this important and not performing a fully connected layer? Like you can always make a vector out of a 28 by 28 or 32 by 32 image and then perform this. The reason why we do this in the context of the same example of image recognition, they say that one corner of an image is not related with another corner of an image. So there is a local correlation between what you are learning in that sense. The other reason, in particularly in the scientific computing, scientific machine learning world, is that when you're using a CNNs, you're not just learning about that particular point, but this particular point, because it is most of these fields of variables which you're looking at is either C0 or C1 or C2 continuous. Most of these fields have similar values in their neighbors as well. So the variations in the neighbors gives us a very good idea of how the variation in your output should also look like. So in other words, you're learning these small features or Fourier frequencies, which would be helpful in predicting the shapes much better or solutions much better. We'll take another closer look at these convolution layers. So earlier we spoke about how a 3 by 32 by 32 image or a 32 by 32 by 3 image, when once you convolve it over a 5 by 5 by 3, gives you 1 by 28 by 28. We earlier focused on 1 by 28 by 28, or the first one channel part. How do we get the 28 by 28 is of concern, or which is what we'll be talking about right now. So consider you have a 7 by 7 input with you, a 7 by 7 matrix, and you have a 3 by 3 filter, and you perform one dot product over here as shown, where you're having a 3 by 3 matrix embedded on top of it. In this case, you get one value. You stride it by 1 here, then you get another value dot product, and then you stride it by another, you get another value, and again stride by another and you get another value, and then finally you do another to get a 5 outputs in one row. Same way, when you perform this operation on the 5 columns, then you get 5 by 5 output. This kind of convolution operation is going to give you this much. So now let's say if you perform the same operation with stride 2, then that first gives you this, and then you get this, which is going to give you 7 by 7 by 7 by 7, and then again another 3 by 3 comes here, gives you like a 3 by 3 output. Now when you try to perform a stride of 3, it doesn't exactly apply here because you have a 7 by 7, you apply there and then you come here, and then this vector here is going to be lost. This column will not apply anything. One way to avoid this issue is by padding zeros. So you can pad zeros and then get rid of these kinds of edge effects, if you will, and that will give you a better prediction. So that gives you the reason why from 32 you go to 28 and from 28 you go to 24. Now, this some criterions which we would like to mention when you're designing a convolutional neural network is that if you shrink the size of this too fast, then that is also not good. But having said that, using a 1x1 convolution is also not a very bad idea. This also has its own advantages. We'll talk about 1x1 convolutions much later in the presentation as well. So a 1x1 convolution is nothing but you are taking the 64-dimensional vector of your 64 channels and then processing it into a 32-dimensional channel. In other words, there is a linear map or a map between each pixel in the 56 by 56 input to a 56 by 56 output, just that you are now condensing the 64-dimensional vector into a 32-dimensional vector for each pixel or each node. So in other words, you're not changing the X and Y, the 56 by 56 dimension, you're just changing the 32 by 32 dimension alone. Okay. Now, when you perform pooling, what do we do? In pooling, what we do is we say you start with a 224 by 224 image. By pooling, you get 112 by 112 image. Now, why is this important? You often don't need to capture a lot of information in the local neighborhood. You would want information which is much more global. So the way you ensure that you get those long range dependencies is by using pooling, where you start from here and you say your feature over here have some cross interaction. The way you learn that is by performing one pooling where the distance between these two pixels will reduce, and then perform another pooling, the distance further reduces. And now a feature vector or a filter of a particular size can now learn these features. So in other words, you are reducing all the non-meaningful information and only storing meaningful information relevant to what our task of learning is. So pooling is also helpful by making it more manageable in terms of memory requirements and other computational requirements which one faces. And max pooling is one particular pooling operation where you take the maximum value of activations and put it in the output. In other words, if you have look at this 4x4 matrix, 6, 8, 3, and then 4 are the maximum values of these 2x2 filters which you're having. This is max pooling. Now, once you learned about convolution layer, max pooling, and what fully connected or dense layers are, let's look at a few architectures which we use for neural surrogates. So different architectures for neural surrogates have been used. Two of the most prominent ones is convolutional autoencoders and U-Nets. Convolutional autoencoders take in an image of, say, a particular size and perform a series of convolution operations and then convert it into a fully connected layer, a dense layer. And from this dense layer, it reshapes it back and then it performs a series of deconvolution or transpose convolution operations to get back the original size of your image or the original size of your nodes mesh, and gives you this. Now you can perform some kind of operation because there is an analogous, say you start with a 225 by 224 mesh. Now you'll end up again with a 224 by 224 mesh in the end. So you start with a solution SD. Now you will go to a unknown SD to known values of SD to unknown values of UD. Now, this approach is very robust. People have been using it for a while and it gives you very good results. However, over the past few years, there has been a surge of use of U-Nets and its derived networks like pyramid structural U-Nets and U-Net++ and other different architectures, which use the same phenomena as convolutional autoencoder. So you perform convolutions, a set of convolutions and a set of transpose convolutions, along with batch normalization and other layers. Apart from this, you also perform something called a skip connection, where you concatenate the vectors of same dimension together to improve performance. In other words, so say you start with the 64 cubed, in this case, a 3D convolution. You perform 3D convolution with stride 2, then you get around 32 by 32 by 32, which is 32 cubed, and then 16 cubed, and then 8 cubed. Once you come to 8 cubed and 4 cubed, now when you do perform transpose convolution, you again come back to 8 cubed. Maybe not 256, but maybe it is 128 dimensional. So now what you do is you take 8 cubed times 128 dimensional input over here and an 8 cubed times 128 dimensional output coming from transpose convolution, concatenate them together to get a 256 dimensional input, 256 channels input for 8 cubed. And those 8 cubed times 256 channels goes through a transpose convolution, giving us again 16 cubed feature vector of 64 dimensions. And this 64 dimension with this 64 dimension gives you 128 dimension after concatenation. And after this, you perform another transpose convolution to get 32 cubed. 32 cubed with this 32 goes further here, which is 64 cubed. And then finally, you predict the original field. This kind of a unit architecture helps us in training because of one reason, that you are performing the same operations as regular convolutional autoencoder, but at the same time, because of these skip connections, one, you reduce a lot of losses coming from gradient vanishing towards the beginning of your neural network. And the other option is that you may end up doing other things, such as reducing the memory footprint, and you're reducing lesser number of layers to get the same performance. Now, this brings an end to what convolutional autoencoders or what neural surrogate architectures are. After this, now we will look at the connection with pins. So we have explained what convolutional neural networks are and everything. But how is convolutional neural networks and all the CNN-based PDE solvers related to physics-informed neural networks? As we saw earlier, physics-informed neural networks takes in a spatial domain of X and time domain T as an input and then predicts an output U. Now consider one intermediate layer of that particular physics-informed neural network, where your intermediate latent representation is say 64 dimension, and it goes to 32 dimension. Now, I will bring in an analogy that say you perform this kind of an operation on 56 by 56 uniformly defined nodes. Then the operation you're performing over here is equivalent to what you saw in a 1x1 convolution. In other words, when we perform a 1x1 convolution, as I covered in a few slides back, you start with a 64 dimensional vector. And from this 64 dimensional vector, you go to a 32 dimensional vector with a weights of 1x1. In other words, you are making one kind of a fully connected network between one pixel over here to one pixel over here. Same way you can make another fully connected layer between this pixel and this pixel. Fortunately, since convolutions are all shared weights, where each filter shares weight with other filters beside and everything. Same way in the case of physics-informed neural network, you perform the same operations for different collocation points. Imagine that those collocation points are on a regular grid. Then you can consider this to be a particular kind of operation. Now, natural question which leads to everyone's heart is that what happens when you are dealing with a very irregular mesh? If it is a uniform mesh, then you can argue that it is a uniform convolution or a 1x1 convolution. But what if it is on a mesh? In that case, we consider this, say a tetrahedral mesh or a triangular mesh. Then this, what pin is performing is nothing but 1x1 convolution in graph space or a graph convolutional neural network. In other words, if I would like to simplify what pins do, I could technically say that it is nothing but a 1x1 convolutional neural network, or it is a convolutional neural network made wholly and solely based on 1x1 convolutions. So say if you start with X as your input, and then you have a neural network which is predicting U, and this neural network has, say, you start from a 3-dimensional X to a 64-dimensional output, and then from the 64 you go to 32, and then from 32 you go to 1. I could represent this as nothing but an image of, say, whatever resolution your mesh is. You're performing, that would be nothing but 3-dimensional. And from this 3-dimensional image, now you perform a 1x1 convolution of, say, 64 dimensions. So this was 64 dimension. So from this 3-dimensional input, you go to a 64-dimensional, 64 filters of conv1D to get the particular this particular output. Now, once you have the 64, you can now perform a full, another 1x1 convolution. So from here, you go by 1x1 convolution. And from here again, you can perform another 1x1 convolution of 32 dimension to give you this latent vector. And from this 32, you can perform another 1x1, giving you just one layer of one filter of 1x1, giving you just the U value at the output. So this is the case of how there is similarity between pins and the CNN based architectures we would be looking at. So the similarity is that on a regular grid, if you perform a 1x1 fully convolutional neural network with just 1x1 convolution filters, then it is nothing but pins. Now, while this is a similarity, the difference here is that pins use automatic differentiation to compute the derivative with respect to U. So you have a U, and from that U, when you want to compute the derivative with respect to your input X, then you take automatic differentiation. Now, instead of automatic differentiation, you can also use CNN, like traditional numerical based derivatives in this CNN based approach. And that way we can define natural ways which have been as well established in numerical methods. How do we compute residuals, and how do we minimize these residuals in a convolutional neural network sense? So that becomes the crux of what we will be covering today in this tutorial, or in this session of the tutorial. So in particular, where does it affect? We spoke about the input and output, and we spoke about how inputs and outputs are changing from collocation points to a mesh. Then we learned on how these meshes will need to be learned using convolutional neural networks. We learned about CNNs. How do you train these neural networks? We need loss functions to be defined on these CNNs to perform these operations. Here's where the novelty of bringing numerical methods to the world of machine learning, or the scientific machine learning, comes in. So first approach we look at is finite difference based approach. In finite difference based approach, what we do is you define a discrete grid D over the whole domain, and say on this whole domain, you now perform either a forward difference or a central difference at each node of the grid to obtain the derivatives. In other words, say this is your node where you want to compute the derivative. Say this is U, and you want to compute dou U by dou X. So this difference will give me dou U by dou X. And this difference over here will give me dou U by dou Y. And this dou U by dou Y and dou U by dou X is something which we get in the case of by just performing one operation. Now imagine we looked at how convolutions filters are implemented, right? So imagine I have a 3x3 filter where weights at these 4 corners are considered to be 0. and I consider the weight of this particular point also to be 0. And if I want to compute, or instead of 0, if I can consider this also to be 0 and just -1 here and 1 here, then that is forward difference. If you want central difference, then you can do -1, 1, and then 2, or 1, 1, and -2 to get different ways of defining the finite differences. Now, once we define this 3x3 filter, now if you perform this 3x3 filter throughout the whole domain, then we get the derivatives at each location. There are some special cases where, like in the border, how you compute these finite differences, which is a much more detailed topic we don't cover. Most often we assume, because we pad with another set of zeros, or we replicate this node further over here. So we replicate those nodes to obtain 0 derivatives in the boundary. That will ensure Neumann boundary condition that way. And this way we can get better results. And next, this convolution filter is moved from one probe node to another probe node. And that way you obtain the derivatives for the whole domain. Once you define these derivatives, you can now evaluate the PDE strong form, and that strong form will be minimized. What happens is you start with an SD, you get a UD. Now using SD and UD, you perform FDM-based loss function calculation, where you perform the convolution to operate, get all the differential, all the variables in the partial differential equation, evaluate them for each node, and even including the derivatives. And then now you perform a finite difference-based residual computation. And this residual is minimized by using traditional gradient descent approaches, which we have looked at in the previous session. So this is about finite difference. Now we look at a finite element based approach. So by the way, there are several papers, not just one or two papers using finite difference approach, where researchers have used both strong form, the weak form, and other kinds of approaches like a Ritz form, functional form, or an energy functional form to compute these residuals, and then you can perform the optimization. There are several papers which we will be linking in this PowerPoint when we submit it. And same way for finite element, although not many people have worked on finite element based approaches, it also uses the same flavor of convolution operations and other things we looked at in the previous slide. The goal of finite element based approach is also similar to the goal which we looked at when we were dealing with finite difference. We still want to minimize a residual. We still want to have an objective function or a loss function. But in this case, the loss function or the minimization of loss which we are performing here is not just on the nodes, which was the case in finite difference and finite volume methods. Here instead, we are going to perform this residual minimization for the whole element. And for this, we use a Galerkin formulation where we define a test function and multiply that over the whole domain. And we would like this residual to go to 0. From this test function, we can now, using some simplification of energy formulation obtained from Rayleigh-Ritz method, we get this L of x, which is the energy functional, where nu of x is a particular set of known quantities, and this is the unknown quantities derivatives. Now, one might be noticing here that in this particular case, we are actually assuming that we are solving for Poisson equation. This is certainly extendable to other problems as well, but here in this particular session, we would be focusing on just Poisson equation, just to have a better understanding of what these methods are. So you would want to minimize this integral. How do we compute this integral? That's something we cover in the next few slides. So we first consider one element, a square, and we want to minimize this L of x in this square. The way we do that is by first defining a set of 4 Gauss points, or a set of n number of Gauss points within an element. And once you define these 4 Gauss points, you need to also evaluate the values of U and nu at these locations. The way we do that is by interpolating the values at these nodal locations to here. And for that, we define some basis functions. So the basis functions basically take in these 4 nodes values. And so say there are some weights, W1, W2, W3, W4. These interpolated values come from the distance to the point from the node itself. So this is trilinear interpolation, if you will. And from these kinds of trilinear or bilinear interpolations, we can get the values at these Gauss points. So this Gauss point is computed using these yellow basis functions. These green are computed using the other set of basis functions. Red is used for another set of basis functions, and then blue has another set of basis functions. Now we define, once we define these basis functions and we perform the interpolation and everything, we also need to perform interpolation of the derivatives. Now, we do not have the derivative for u theta itself. We don't have derivatives at these nodal locations. However, we do have the derivatives defined for the basis functions itself. Since we have derivatives for the basis function defined, we are assuming that within the element, u is nothing but just a linear combination of some x derivative of x times the basis function values. Now we can perform an interpolation to compute those derivatives at these Gauss points as well. Once we get those derivatives, now we can obtain this L of x sum for one particular element, because that is nothing but going to be summation of the values over here times the Gauss point quadrature at this point, and then summation of the value of L of x here times the Gauss point quadrature over here. And the same way you do the computation of these two as well. And when you add them together, that gives you the L of x for one element. Now what we do is from this one element, if you look at it, this is each basis function computation is nothing but using 4 nodes and interpolating these 4 nodes to get one value. Now, you can perform this operation for each of the basis function. That gives you 4 different channels of a mesh grid. And from these 4 different channels of mesh, now we can perform convolution on these 4, each of the channels to obtain the basis function values at each Gauss point. Once we have these basis function values at each Gauss point, now we can, we have also computed L of x at each Gauss point. Now we can compute the sum of all the L of x values at each node and add them together. That gives us the finite element loss, which I represent here as the finite element residual. Now, depending on the basis function definitions and other things, one could use a strong form or a weak form, depending on how one would want to solve it. So this is the finite element based loss function, and this is your neural network, which we looked at earlier. Here also it is defined using convolution operations. Finite difference also uses like the same convolution operation to define the operations. Once we have this kind of an approach, you can minimize this residual. If the solution has not converged, then you perform this operation again and again, and again. Once it has converged, you get GNN of star. This could be a convolutional autoencoder or a UNet or any other deep neural network. And from this GNN star, now you can perform inference on any new input and obtain output of any PDs, the PD solution given as input, given the input. So this is the inference pipeline. So in total, if I want to extend it to say even 3D neural PD solvers and all we have to do is take in the 3D input, send it to a 3D unit, and then get 3D output. Perform the same 3D, the convolution operations we looked at in the previous slide on this 3D output using 3D convolutional layers. And from there, we can obtain one loss value, which we will be minimizing. So that is about the 3D neural PD solvers. Now we look at a demo of how these neural PDE solvers work. Before we go into the demo, let us recap and at what puzzle and what we are going to look at. So we particularly solve in this demo the Poisson equation in a 2D parametric domain. The Poisson's equation is defined over here, where negative of nu x times del ux, del dot of the divergence of that is equal to 0 is your PDE. And you're applying some boundary condition on the left of the domain, and that becomes your source. And on the right side of your domain, that becomes your sink. And then you have defined some Neumann boundary conditions on other boundary locations. And this is your PDE, which we will be solving. Since we are dealing with a domain D, which is in R2, that defines your field space. Now, nu of x here is the material diffusivity. Now, different materials have different diffusivity, and different microstructures have different diffusivity and all. One way to classify whether our method works well or not is by actually inferencing on several values of nu to identify whether nu satisfy for any new values, we are able to obtain u of x correctly. So the way it happens is you start with a nu of x comma omega as a function. So in other words, you're defining nu of x as a function of omega in terms of a sum of a Kernan-Love expansion. And here in this expansion, you're going to use different ai and omega I values, which are all real numbers. And depending on how many terms you use in this Kernan-Love expansion, in this case, we're using 4, you could use 6 or 8 or anything, then that gives you different diffusivity maps we would be using for parameterizing nu. So in other words, this is a parametric PDE parameterized with different nu values defined by this Kernan-Love expansion or KL expansion, KL sum. Now, before we look at some results, let's look at the code. So again, this is again shown on the RocketML platform, which we would be using in this demo. So for this particular demo, which we are showing here, we would be needing a package called diffnet, which is a publicly released package from our side. This package is a Python package made on top of PyTorch and PyTorch Lightning. These are the two dependencies of this package. This defines both the finite element and finite difference based operators, which we were talking about. So for example, diffnet fdm.py, which is inside this package, has all the derivative kernels as the Sobel correction matrices and everything defined in diffnet fdm class. And you have methods defined for derivative xx, derivative yy, and different derivatives we would be needing for solving the diffnet FDM. Same way, diffnet FEM is another class where we have defined the Gauss point evaluation, how the basis functions have to be evaluated for different Gauss points, and then how we can assemble the convolution layers to perform the convolution upfront in a very quick way. The whole code is capable of running on CPU and GPU. There are no restrictions on those aspects. Now, apart from this, we also have provided some helper functions for visualization and for writing ParaView files, and even for the KL sum computations and everything. We also defined some helper networks as well. So there are a lot of network architectures we have already predefined here, such as the autoencoders, the ResNets, the UNets, and this is 1x1 convolution neural network, which we discussed about. So there are several of these network architectures which could be used. And we have also defined two different classes of data sets. So in a parametric, you have different classes, like if you're dealing with a set of images for which you're performing parametric PDE solve, or say you're performing parametric PDE solve for the KL sum parametric case, then you use this data set. Same way in the single instances, you have different dataset classes, and those dataset classes are all useful for different geometries we will be dealing with. This is still an ongoing development. So this is a very preliminary release from our end. We'll be still focusing on how to improve this for different other PDEs and everything. But there are a lot of examples given for each PDE we'll be talking about. For example, Burger's equation, Eikonel, Navier-Stokes equation are some examples we have also provided. And the most explored of all is the Poisson equation, because it's very easy to solve. In this case, we have two examples or several examples shown here for KL-sum computations or different examples other than that. Same way in single instances, we have a whole host of other examples we would be using, or we could use to define the network and define the training. Remember that you can use DiffNet either using a neural network or in a single instance case without a neural network as well. In which case it is just a gradient-based optimization for obtaining the solution. This is the DiffNet package we would be using. So in terms of preliminaries of installation, we need to install these 4 packages. One is PyTorch and Torch Vision, and then PyTorch Lightning. Then the Git package, which we have publicly made available. And finally, MLflow for some of the deployment tasks which we looked at in pins. Same applications can be performed here as well. So these are the dependencies which we need to install. Once the dependencies are installed, when we go down, we perform first few imports. So first we import OS, JSON, PyTorch, Matplotlib, and then some more imports such as the MLflow and PyTorch Lightning, and setting the seed for all the random numbers which we will be using for making sure that it is all reproducible. And we also use DiffNets, import the DiffNet package which we created. And we also import some neural networks already defined there, such as AE, which is the autoencoder. And we also, because we are looking at DiffNet 2D FEM for Poisson equation, we import DiffNet 2D FEM. And then the parametric data set we are using is KL-sum stochastic, which we import here as well. So now before we go further and explain how we will perform these operations, we need to understand some of the classes and methods which we would need to define for performing this. In PyTorch, usually when you want to define a new data set, you need to create a class called a class with a particular name, with inheriting from this torch.utils.dataset and data.dataset. And here you initialize some things, process them, and you need to create 2 methods, which is the double_length and double_get item, to define what items do you need at a particular point and what number of samples does the whole data set contain. Now, using this too, and here in the crux where we define the data set, we define the domain, which is going to be the new values obtained from this generate diffusivity tensor function, which I am importing from this geninputCalc method. And this generate diffusivity tensor domain is going to give me the new, and I create 2 boundary condition locations. So these boundary BC1 and BC2 are nothing but masks, which we will be using to apply Dirichlet boundary conditions exactly. Now, what we do is we initialize everything to be zeros, and exactly on the locations where the source has to be 1, the sink has to be made, the U value at the sink has to be made 0. Then those locations we put to be 1. And now once we store all this information in the data set, now we will look at how we define the Poisson equation class itself. In the Poisson equation class, we inherited from DiffNet 2D Poisson. Some of the key methods we need to mention here is that we define a loss function. This loss function is nothing but taking a self and then U and the input tensor and the forcing tensor. Forcing tensor in this case would be 0, but in a generic case, it could have some force as well, forcing term. And now from the input tensors which we are sending, in this case, it's a batch of input tensors. For those batch of input tensors, we obtain the first channel of those batch of input tensors, which is the new. The second channel of the input tensors is the mask for boundary condition 1, which is source. And we also obtain the mask for boundary condition 2, which is the sink. The way we apply the mask is wherever the BC1 is true, we would make the temperature to be, or the U to be 1. The way we do it is by saying 1 times U times 0. U times anything times 0 is going to be 0, plus 1 will always ensure that this is always going to be 1. And this is going to ensure that anytime we apply this boundary condition, this term is always going to be 0. Now, there are several advantages and disadvantages of applying the boundary conditions exactly. One advantage of applying the boundary conditions exactly is we don't have to solve for the boundary conditions every single time, which makes the optimization problem much easier. The disadvantage of using this kind of an approach is that if there is a lot of vanishing gradients or exploding gradients in your neural network, then there is every possibility that these two application of boundary conditions exactly will fail very badly. In that case, we will, instead of applying this as a boundary condition, we would be applying this as a mask and adding it as an augmented objective function on the end. Now, once we have all these U defined and already applying the boundary conditions and all, now we perform Gauss point evaluations for each of the variable we are looking at. And we also perform Gauss point derivative f x and derivative of y evaluation as well. That gives you new GP, FGP, UGP, UXGP, UYGP. Now, using these terms, now we can compute the loss function L of x, which we defined in the main slides. That gives you the element-wise residual. From this element-wise residual, now we can obtain the loss itself by taking the mean of it. In every forward pass of this class, you get a batch of data, and that batch of data has both input tensors and forcing tensors. We send both the input tensors, we send the input tensors to the network and obtain U. And from U, input tensors and output forcing tensor, we can now perform the loss computation. So a training step will look something like this. You have a batch ID, and you perform a forward evaluation and get these terms. These terms together go into U, input tensor, forcing tensor, giving you a loss value. This loss value will be returned and optimized by the PyTorch Lightning modules. The optimizer can be defined in some cases where because the energy function is a convex one, we can quickly use LBFGS to obtain results very quickly. And in some cases where the network is making it non-convex and non-trivial, we could use ADAM with some kind of a learning rate scheduler or something to define the optimizers and optimization process. At the end of each epoch, we would like to obtain query for a particular point and visualize them. So the way we do that is by taking the num queries to be IDs to be 6, and we create a plt.subplot using matplotlib. And for that subplot, we evaluate the inputs and forcing, and that inputs and forcing is going to be sent to the forward function. And that forward function goes, and once you obtain U and everything, we obtain the loss. And we then can visualize the new BC1, BC2, U, K, and then we can visualize most of these results here, and we can also store it. So every time I run this, it stores in all this information after every epoch. How do I train this kind of a network architecture or the whole class? Because this is all written in PyTorch Lightning, we just have to invoke some of the functions of PyTorch Lightning to do this. We define few parameters. Then we import the dataset or instantiate the dataset class we created first. Then we instantiate the neural network, autoencoder in this case. with different parameters. And then we instantiate the Poisson class, which we created. With this class, we send in as an input the network, the data set, the batch size, the domain size or the mesh size, and the learning rate. All these together go as an input to the Poisson class. Now we need to define some loggers and some training strategies which we will be using. So loggers and is going to create a TensorBoard logging file for me, and CSV logger is going to store all the logs in a CSV. Early stopping is used to avoid some kind of overfitting, and you can provide early stopping criteria to be either some loss or some PDE loss or something, and then you define a patience value, and that becomes your early stopping. Same way, you can define checkpointing, where depending on what your minimum loss of your data set is, that particular epoch's weights will be stored, and that those weights would be what we would be using as best weights for inference. So we define early stopping, checkpoint, logger, CSV logger, and everything. All these things go as callbacks and loggers with some max epochs and some other conditions, such as deterministic is equal to true and profiler is equal to simple, giving us more options of how to, looking at profiler and other things. Once you define this trainer, what we do is we also want to store all the information we are performing here to deploy the model as well. So we not just want to train the model. For performing this inference at scale, we would like to perform deploy this model in using MLflow, as we looked at in the previous session. So the way we do that is we create some utility function to get the Conda environment and add some pip libraries or whatnot which we need, and some PyTorch model wrapper for how do we parse the information once we create a deploy model, and how do we predict it and all. And here's where the training starts. We first get the MLflow's environment, default Conda environment. We add some dependencies which we need. Then we start auto-logging the information from PyTorch, mlflow.pytorch.autolog. And then within the scope of mlflow.startRun as run, we do trainer.fit of base case. This will start the training process. While the training process is happening, it will store a lot of information. So just in case I did not cover before, the logger stores information in the name of the scale sum times 32. If the domain size is 32, then it stores it as scale sum underscore 32. That's this folder. And in that folder, everything is stored. Same way here also, we store all the information in that folder. So logger.log there gives me the log directory, and we store all the artifacts of all the files which we have over here in an artifacts path of MLflow. Same way, we also log the model of our neural network after training, and that's also stored with the Conda environment and everything. And then finally, we also save the final weights just for the sake of backup, where we save basecase.network, and we save the network's weights in the log directory along with the as a network.pt file. And then we end the session run of MLflow. This whole thing will start training. So it initially starts creating the network and along with other parameter list and everything. And then it performs the training. It may give some warnings because the PyTorch Lightning is evolving over time. And after the warning, it performs the training and gives you the profiler. Once everything is run, it logs everything and creates this model path, which we could use. And then once we have all this information ready with us, if you want to look at all this information, then you can come inside this KLSum32. Every time I run this code once, it creates another version. Rather than overwriting all the files here, it creates different versions of the runs I am performing. So this is my latest run. And here you can see that after first epoch, this is how the result looks like. And then slowly towards the end of 10th epoch, it tries to form somewhat more meaningful shapes from whatever we have in the initial. domain. It also stores some hyperparameter file and then some network checkpoint files. And this is the TensorBoard event file, which we will be using if in case of any log, checking the logs and visualizing the logs and everything. So once we have all this information, so we have PyTorch inference and everything. In terms of how we deploy this model, the way that happens is we go to the experiments tab here. And this stores some set of runs. So every time I run with a MLflow session, then it stores the tab. And I come here, I see that there is a latest run I ran a few hours back, and that is something stored over here. And then I click on it. Then it shows me that there are all the artifact files which I have been using, all stored over here. All I have to do is convert to model to deploy it. And using that deployment, I can perform inference using the inference code I have written here. So that is going to use requests and JSON, and is going to get the response from the app we are going to deploy. Okay, so this is the overarching picture of what a DiffNet demo looks like. Now that we have covered all the aspects of DiffNet, one aspect which we could look at in the end is the sample results of how we operate, what we obtain. So this is the final result. We have new, and this new is going to is taken as an input, and you predict u theta as an output. Compared with the finite element output, which we see here, the residual or the norm of output is very, very small, of the order of 10 to the power minus 3. And we see that we also perform some comparisons with pins, because this is a session where we are comparing, like we are contrasting between pointwise approaches to CNN-based solvers. We need to compare between DiffNets and pins and what the advantages are and all. While DiffNets require a lot more memory in terms of performing these operations, it gives us one order of magnitude lesser error compared to what you get from pins. Same way, this is obtained for both two different kinds of boundary conditions, and in both the cases, we obtain similar results. So, few concluding remarks. In this tutorial or this session of the tutorial, we first looked at convolutional neural networks for scientific machine learning. And then I explained about a finite difference-based formulation of this loss function, and then finite element-based loss function as well. And then I gave a demo of DiffNets and how to deploy these DiffNets at scale. So this ends this session. I'd like to take some questions if you have any, and thank you very much.